Hello everyone, today we will be going over setting up msys2 along with codelite to compile and configure libswift and the ascending source. Before we get started, you will need to download msys2 from our tutorial, and to let you know, we will only be going over what is in this tutorial, nothing else. So first we will then start off by downloading either the 64-bit if you have a 64-bit operating system, or a 32-bit if you have a 32-bit operating system. For the 32-bit people, if you go to the 32-bit one, at the top you will see that it says download msys2 x86_64. You don't want that. You want to make sure you download the below, which is the i686. Okay, once you do that, we can then go to installing our msys2. And during the installation, for the installation folder, make sure you name and put this exact path which is in your C drive, and then msys64. If it says msys32, please change it to 64 because codelite and the sending source is set up to only look in the msys64 folder. You can name the start menu shortcuts whatever you want, and we go install it. While it's installing, msys2 is a Linux based emulator. It is used to emulate the Arch Linux pack manager, which it makes it very easy to download dynamic libraries, static libraries, source codes, programs that are pre-compiled for it, and so forth. But msys2 has their own repo which they get dynamic libraries and such from, and it's very useful and it's very easy to install all those libraries. A good example of easy versus hard would be you trying to find and compile FreeType 2. FreeType is very hard to compile dynamic library. Many operating systems it can be easy, but for Windows it is very difficult, and this is where msys2 comes in handy for compiling as well as keeping those libraries up to date and in tip-top shape. Once the msys2 64-bit setup is done, or 32-bit setup, you unclick the run because we do not want to run it yet, and then we click finish. From there we will then go to our start menu, and we will find whatever folder we created in our start menu for the msys stuff, and you will notice that there either is a Win32 shell or a Win64 shell, which these will determine the MingW 32 or 64-bit compilers. For this, you will want to use the Win32 shell. The other one, you would want to use the 64-bit shell if you want to compile 64-bit programs. But for this, we're going to use the Win32 shell. But before we do this, we will need to go into our program files. So open up Documents, go to our C drive, to the folder that we made, and into a Home folder, and into the username folder. It should appear as your computer's username that you are currently on. And in here you'll find the bash rc folder. If you don't see it, you're probably on Windows 7, and you may need to go into the options and find file name extensions to be able to see these file name extensions, because they are not actual file names. There's no actual names, it's just extensions. So I would suggest using Notepad++, or another thing would be a WordPad. I wouldn't use Notepad because Notepad doesn't have word wrapping very well. So we open this, go all the way down to the bottom, and from here at the way bottom, after all the commented out code that they have, we will, from the tutorial, copy our shell code like so and save. Basically the shell code sets it up so when you're using MingW32 it sets up the 32 paths, or MingW64 it sets up all the 64 paths so everything compiles correctly. From there we will then go to actually opening msys2. I will just open the MingW32 one. And in here you will want to run our update core command first. It is essential to run update core before you run any installations or updates. Otherwise, if you do not run update core before you run the pacman -SYU, it will update the core files along with other files, and the other files need the core files to install correctly, and if the core files update before them and they're not being used with the newest updates, it can cause the old core that you currently have open to conflict with the new core files which the installer is trying to use. So you want to make sure you update the core files before you update anything else. After the updating of the core is done, you want to close and then reopen msys2. So I have a link over here already. And then within that, you then want to update the rest of the files to make sure they're all up to date. So pacman, which is our package manager, and then score SYU. Y stands for check the database, so I can do this and it'll check to see if all the repo databases are up to date, and the U stands for actually checking for updates and updating. If you put them all together, you then get a check for a database and the updates, and like so. If you want to search for certain programs, you can also type in -S, then a lowercase s, space, then the name of the library or file you might want to find, and you might be able to find it that way. Another way is in the next section you will see the pacman with just the capital S. That is for installing programs and libraries. So once that's finished, we will then move on to the next line. Copy, paste. Also the note, you can either right click paste or you can middle scroll bar button paste on your mouse. Now, once these are done installing, you will notice that down here we have two separate sections, a 32-bit and a 64. It is installing the same exact thing, just the 32-bit is leaving out the 64-bit toolchain. If you're only going to compile ever with 32-bit, then you don't have to install the 64-bit toolchain, but I recommend it that you install it and maybe get used to using libswift as a 64-bit to compile 64-bit programs. But you will also need this toolchain if you want to compile 64-bit programs with codelite. So once that's all installed, we will then move on to these toolchains. Since I'm on 64-bit, I like using both. And when it comes to default all, you just press enter, enter again, Y for yes, enter, and then we're good to install. We will then just let that install real quick. Okay, now while it's installing, I'll quickly go over the next part. In the next part, we also still have another 32-bit or 64-bit setup. If you're only ever going to use 32-bit, or if you're on a 32-bit operating system, then I suggest you just download these because there's no need for you to download both. On 64-bit, since I am on 64-bit, I will be downloading the 32-bit libraries as well as 64-bit libraries for libping, freetype, and glfw. These libraries are required to compile libswift. Also, as a note, all the libraries and programs within msys2 are Windows compatible. Even if you may see Linux-only libraries within it, they have been compiled and changed so that way they can run on Windows operating system. But because of that, they will not be able to run on Linux unless you're running it through the Windows emulator. Okay, since that part's done, we will now go to the next part. Install libping, glfw, and freetype. During this installation, though, you will probably see warning messages, and you can ignore them because that's just freetype's font configuration being set up. And sometimes it may warn because it failed or whatnot, but it doesn't actually affect how the library is being used. Okay, and once we're done with that, we have everything installed and set up and prepared to get the Swift library. So we can then use git to clone it from our link below from GitLab, and this will clone Swift library into our home Genesis folder within the msys2 folder. Once in there, we can then move to our folder Swift that we just got, like so, using CD, which allows you to move around. And then in there, we will run our shell command. This shell command then goes out and prepares our configuration and make.am file, so that way we can use the configuration tools to make our finalized make file to build libswift for the version that we are building for, 32-bit or 64-bit. Once that's done, we will then use mkdir, which will allow us to make a directory. And then we will cd into that directory. And then once in that directory, we will then run our configuration command with, make sure that there's a double dot like so. You can copy and paste it if it makes it easier for you. And at the end, you will see the prefix equals with a slash mingw32. That can also be changed to a slash mingw64 if you're using the 64-bit or compiling for 64-bit libraries. So we are using 32-bit libraries for this tutorial. We will run the configuration file. It will do a bunch of tests and checks to make sure that we have everything. If not, it will fail, but as long as you installed everything correctly and you made sure that you followed this tutorial down to the bat, you should have no problems. Once done, it will then show you back to your path. Like so. Now since we have the make file made, we can then go ahead and build and install our libswift library suite into our mingw bin folder, include folder, as in the libs folder. To do this, we would then type in make and then install. Now if you have multiple core processors, dual core, quad core, or 8-core processor, you can add a -J and then how many cores plus 1 that you have. Below I gave you some examples for -J3 for dual core, -J5 for quad, and -J9 for 8-core. I have an 8-core processor, so I can use all 8 cores to compile our source. And the install command at the end will then install into the msys libraries. It will install it to the bin folder, the include folder, and the lib folder. CC is the compiling the objects part, and then ccld will be compiling all the objects into the finalized library. Once all the files are compiled, it is then installing it into the directories now. Once installed, we can then go ahead and close our msys2 command panel, and then go ahead with downloading codelite and installing it. For 64-bit, you might want the 64-bit Windows. I suggest you get the weekly build. For those 32-bit users out there, sorry, but you have to use the stable edition only, because the weekly builds are only in 64-bit. So I already downloaded mine. We'll go ahead with running it. If you have antivirus and stuff, they may scan it and it may display error during the whole process. Ignore it. Let Avast or whatever antivirus you have do its scans, and once done, you should be able to open it right up and install. It's nice to have an antivirus that does that. Well, you just go through the process regularly. There's nothing to really change with the installer. Now, once we are done, we can then go in and open up codelite. And yet again, my antivirus will be scanning it because it's a new program. Once your antivirus has no problem with it, we can then go ahead and actually set everything up. And because I already had it set up once, I just uninstalled it. I will go through and do a walkthrough about the actual setup. So when it first sets up, it'll ask you a few questions about what settings you want to set and so forth towards the installation. For the most part, do default until you get to the build. Just ignore that and click next, and then after the next part of the build, it'll go into codelite. From here, you can go to build settings. In build settings, we then go to add compiler. Scan compiler will not find the msys2 mingw compiler set unless, of course, you had those added to your Windows path. But since we do not, we will need to add it manually, which is actually really easy. Just click add existing compiler, go to your C drive, msys2 to our mingw32 folder for 32-bit, or the 64-bit one if you want 64-bit, to the bin folder, and that's the folder you want to select. It will bring up a long name. I generally just name it mingw32, and I suggest you name that as well because that is what a sending source is set up to look for a compiler, is that name. So I say OK, and if you go down here and click on it, you will see it found all the linkers and everything and set all the paths. The only thing that we want to change is in here we want to change these G++ as to GCC, so we have a fully compiled C program. It does not need the C++ to compile C programs. And then apply. Okay. Now since the compiler is all set up and ready to compile a sending source, we then would have to download sending source from our link. So in here you can either git clone it with msys64's command console, or you can just download as a zip and unzip it. In this tutorial I downloaded it as a zip. I'm just going to unzip it. I'm just going to zip it to a folder called a source, just to make it easier for me. And I did not like that it did that, but I'll just rename that and then cut and paste this back out here. Okay, now within our a source folder, you will see a client.workspace and a server.workspace. These are for our client and server. You can go ahead and close codelite or use it to open it manually using the workspace settings, but it's just easier to double click on these. If these do not have the codelite symbol next to them, you can right click, properties, change, and then in more apps, scroll through, look for another app. In your program files, find codelite, and click on the codelite.exe and apply, and that will set all .workspaces to codelite, and then you can just simply double click, open. And everything should be already pre-set up for you. And all you should really need to do is just build. Shouldn't have to change anything, and yet again Avast will look new programs. We gotta scan them. No problem found. So it built it. We can go in a source to our client folder to build 32, and yes, it did build it, but we cannot run it yet. Before we run it, we also can just go ahead and build our server. So open our server up. Everything's ready. Build. Everything built without any problems. And then before we can do anything, we also need to go and download our resource files, which here's our resource files that I pre-downloaded as well. You can find the link in the forum topic right here. This will contain the font and images that I used to develop it. Okay, once in here, you can just copy your cut, paste, or whatever you feel like. Go into your client and your build 32, and inside here with exe, just paste those folders with all the images and fonts in them. And from there, we're still not completely done, because then the final part of the tutorial is finding the DLLs. To do this, we will then go to our C drive, msys2, and then since we're using 32-bit, the main W32-bit and the bin folder. To easily find them, you can click types, which will reorder them by their type and generally the name as well. And they should be in the same exact order as what appears on this, with a couple extra libraries in between. So let's go and select those. And we will copy them and paste them in our client folder, as well as go back and paste them inside our server folder. Now we will be able to start a server up. Avast might scan it, and if you have a firewall pop up, allow it, so that way you can open up the port so you can use it. And within that, we can then go back to the client. But before you might be able to connect to your own server, you will need to go into the include folder, globals, and in here you will find game IP, and change this IP address to either your IP address if your router supports loopbacking, or 127.0.0.1 for localhost, and compile that, save and compile, and then you'll be able to run and connect to the server. For this, it's already preset up to my IP address, so we will simply just go into build in our client folder and then run our exe. Should start up, show that's online. Let's make a simple thing first. Accept. Back, then we can just log in. Retrieving all of our game data, and then voila, we are in the alpha build. Well, that wraps up everything for this. If you have any questions or comments, please post them either in the forum, ascendingcreations.com, or on YouTube if you want to. I have left that open for you guys to make that decision on your own. Also, just to quickly wrap up this, there are a couple other ways you can run this. You can run this in debug mode using here or the debugger, or you can just basically run it from the build command run. You can also rebuild or build project and run at the same time, and they have the key functionalities you can look up and figure out yourself. Oh, thank you. This is Andrew Wheeler, signing out.